Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. And today I'm talking to Rob Lee, a former Marine and a PhD student at King's College London, whose research focuses on Russian arms exports. It's good to have you on the show, Rob.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about sort of the other side of the S-400 crisis between the United States and Turkey, to look at it from the Russian arms control or the Russian arms export angle about what could be driving Russian decision-making vis-a-vis Turkey within this air defense system. Let's just start right there. Turkey's obviously absorbing a lot of pressure from the United States. The United States has said that if Turkey after Turkey acquires the S-400, it will be sanctioned under the Counter-America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and the F-35 will not be allowed to be transferred to Turkey. Clearly, the Russians are probably happy about this, but they are also at the center of the storm because they make the S-400. What do you make of all this?
So I think from Russia's perspective, it was quite a unique arms deal. And as you said before, my PhD focused on Russian decision making regarding arms exports and kind of what the driving factors are. Is it more foreign policy motivations? Is it more commercial, what have you? And for the most part, commercial motivations drive Russian arms exports decision making. So it's in order to keep production lines going, to get hard currency receipts, especially now with the ruble devalued, they're even more valuable than they were before. To keep employment ongoing. In a lot of cases, a lot of Russia's defense companies are set up in towns and cities across the Urals, Far East, and Siberia, where a lot of times they are the city forming enterprise, where they are basically the one thing keeping the city together, and basically they have to maintain production. Otherwise, it becomes a massive kind of social and political problem for the leadership. And so, in most cases, in the last 20 years, most export decisions have been driven by commercial reasons, and depending on how what the macroeconomic situation is, Russia can, to a greater or lesser extent, kind of apply some foreign policy kind of direction to that. So, there are a couple, well-known cases with Russia blocking its S-300 deal with Iran, at least initially. The same thing with Libya, where Medvedev went along with the arms embargo against Libya in 2011, and Russia had signed about $1.8 billion worth of contracts with them before that, and they expected, I think, $7 billion over the next few years. Same thing, they blocked a couple deliveries to Syria as well, I think because Israel had objected to it. So they've shown a couple of times that they're willing to block deals when there's an important foreign policy objective to pursue. But for the most part, commercial motivations drive things. And the big change, this is obviously a broader issue for Russia, is post Ukraine, Russia lost its connection with the West, with the U.S., with Europe, and basically had to branch out and develop relations with other countries. And so China was the most obvious one, and the arms export relationship with China changed dramatically too in 2014, including with the S-400 and Su-35 and some other things. And with Turkey in 2017, foreign policy was very much another driver of that relationship. So obviously, I think you cover down on Turkey foreign relationships better than I do. But the way this deal was done was unique. It was uniquely top down, where it was very much negotiated by Putin directly, personally. It was him and Erdogan driving the train on this, not from the bureaucrats kind of coming up. The deal was completed in like less than a year, which was basically unprecedented. With the negotiation with China, it took over 3 years to do that. With India, same thing. It took a number of years. So in a number of the cases, for Russia at least, Putin basically pushed aside some of the bureaucratic issues or red tape to get this done because it was so important on a foreign policy level. And I think continuing every day you hear, some report from the West talking about Katsa and Russia. There's always be some Russian official who will then come out and say, nope, everything's going to plan. We're definitely doing this. They very much want to continue to publicize the deal.
Yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Because, like, as I was, there at the beginning of this as an analyst, and as soon as it became clear in December 2017 that Russia and Turkey were going to sign basically the official agreement, so there was talks over the summer, and then it became official in December. Is every effort for the Americans to increase pressure did not cause a change in the Russian-Turkish dynamic. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how how this differs than the Chinese and the Indian cases, in that, like, how fast it went, and some of the ways in which the Russians were willing to just move things faster for Turkey in ways it hasn't for other countries.
Sure. So, as an overview for the S-400, right? S-400 has been in serial production for Russia since 2007, and they've delivered as part of the state armaments program for Russia from 2011 to 2020. Russia's supposed to receive 56 battalions worth of the S-400, right? So 2 battalions go into a regiment, and then within a battalion, it's typically 6 to 8 launchers, and that obviously can change a little bit. And so with the deals, Turkey is was the second country to sign a export contract for the S-400. First, it was China. China signed a contract for 4 battalions, and that was worth $1.9 billion. Turkey also signed it for 4 battalions, and that was for $2.5 billion. And then India in October signed a contract for 10 battalions, 5 regiments, and that was for $5.43 billion. And so in a comparison of the price per battalion, Turkey paid the most. So Beijing, for China, it was $475 million per battalion. India, it was $543 million per battalion. And for Turkey, it was $625 million per battalion. And so the basically what a lot of the Russian analysts said was that there's an element of a political risk premium put into this. So the value of it was higher, and Turkey was charged more than the other 2 countries. At the same time, Russia made a number of concessions to get this done. So for one, 55% of the contract is covered by a Russian loan. So, according to Erdogan, it's on quite favorable, interest payment level. So it's quite favorable level for Turkey. At the same time, after the deal was arranged last April, Erdogan and Putin met. Initially, the first battalion was supposed to be delivered to Turkey in March 2020, right. And last April they decided to move that up to July 2019. And aside from all the news stories we've seen the last year, basically that hasn't changed. That has stayed the same for the last year, despite what everyone says. And that was seen as a massive concession from Russia, basically to move this up by a year and to move things around as much as possible. And a lot of Russian analysts said basically, there's a provision here where, in order to get the deal done on time, even if Almaz, the producer S-400, even if they don't produce the units on time, Russia would take the S-400 units from its own air defense forces and deliver those first in order to make the timelines for Turkey. And so when you compare the deal with Turkey compared to India and China, both India and China had negotiated for a long time for the system. China's deal basically got done. A lot of it was because after post-Ukraine, Russia wanted to cement relationships with China, and they quickly signed a number of agreements, including that deal. With India, basically the fact that China had already started receiving the S-400, that put pressure on them to start receiving it as well, and they also wanted it expedited. But Turkey was kind of a unique case where they weren't involved in that at all, and at the same time, Russia very much was willing to push this deal through, despite some of the objections, some of the other kind of question marks about, for one, delivering their most sophisticated air defense system to a NATO country. And, obviously there's in any arms export deal, especially with a high technology important weapon system, there's that risk that the technology could get leaked and that your opponents could get it. And obviously Turkey being NATO, there was a massive, technology risk associated with that contract.
Yeah, no, that's really worth fleshing out, because the other thing that the Turks talk about, because historically when Turkey does these big arms procurements, and we're just talking here specifically about air and missile defense, is they've demanded, at least of the United States and of Europe, is a number of offset agreements for local work share and production arrangements. And the thing that has always stuck out to me with this deal, and perhaps it's a little unclear to me, maybe you could flesh it out a little bit, is that on that issue, on the local work share co-production arrangements, the Western offers are better, but the Russian offers, is obviously faster and cost less. So there's a lot of Turkish talk that there's going to be some work share, local production. What do you see on the Russian side about this, and perhaps maybe does this compare in any way to what the Chinese or the Indians got?
So as far as I know, China and India did not get any type of offset in this regard. They didn't get any kind of local production or technology sharing. And for India specifically, they've had the Make in India program for the last number of years, where every arms deal is supposed to involve local production. It's supposed to improve the Indian defense industry's capabilities. And this deal didn't do that. I think in large part it's just because they needed to get this done because of their concern with China, and not to mention with Pakistan as well. So neither of them got that deal. Obviously, Erdogan made that a sticking point in this negotiation. What was reported was that I think there were already concerns with Russia exporting such an important system to a NATO country. And I think when the topic of technology sharing or any kind of localized production, that to a degree that would be concerning, right? So obviously with localized production, that could mean where the customer actually develops some of the systems, builds components, or it could just mean they basically assemble things already built in the supplier country. And so a lot of deals with India, between Russia and India, a lot of them are actually just become assembly agreements, which aren't necessarily as concerning as actually developing the production capability itself. But one of the things that was reported is that the Russian intelligence agencies pushed back pretty heavily against that, where they thought it was a really bad idea to do that. And so in Russia, when Putin makes a decision, that's kind of final. But the decision to export Turkey, once he decided, he's not going to get criticism, but that element of technology sharing was something I think where they put their foot down on. And what was interesting was Erdogan, after the deal was signed, he immediately started talking about the S-500, and he immediately started talking about joint production of the S-500. And I wondered to what extent that was him trying to kind of explain why they didn't get joint production of the S-400 by saying, well, okay, but we will have joint production with the next system, and so it's okay to kind of not do what we're supposed to do in this case. I don't know. I mean, you know better than I would about that, but the technology sharing element basically was a blocking point for Russia, and that was something that Putin didn't give in on, as far as we know.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, there is no local work share or offsets agreements. I mean, there may be some minor stuff, but certainly not in the realm of any of the sensitive technology. I would assume that most of the sensitive stuff on S-400 will be black boxed in Turkey, and probably wrapped up in an end user agreement. I mean, do Russians do that? You would know. Do Russians have the similar type of end user agreement that the U.S. does on some of their exported items?
I don't know the details exactly. Unfortunately, they're not as forthcoming on most of the stuff than we are, and most of the customers don't really publish any information as well. I mean, one of the big things that Russia tries to market themselves as is not having the same kind of political limitations on weapon systems they provide.
Right.
So kind of giving more, allowing countries to use them, kind of however they want to. There probably are some technological kind of safeguards in place, but I haven't seen any of that reported or to what extent that's true.
Yeah, I mean, so just to go back to the S-500, I mean, the way that the S-500 has been framed domestically is that it's a potentially part of the Turkish reaction to the stoppage of the F-35. So Turkey keeps saying that the S-400 is a done deal, and I think for all the reasons you laid out, it really is a done deal. Second of all, they said if you withhold F-35, we'll begin to explore options. One of those options is is co-production of the S-500, which color me skeptical about. Not the least of which because of the nascent status of the S-500 in its developmental cycle. And two is that it's been floated, particularly by the foreign minister, is that they would begin to look at Russian aircraft as a potential replacement. And the two things that I've seen floated out there, or three actually, is the Su-34, the Su-35, and the Su-57. I'm curious what you think of that level. I mean, is there more to come on the Turkish-Russian arms export front?
So Russia certainly wants to expand cooperation, and they've talked a lot about trying to do some joint production of systems, not of the ones you mentioned, and not of the particularly strategic important systems, more something more like helicopters than anything else. Mm-hmm. But when that stuff gets mentioned, it gets mentioned in the Russian press, and generally, I think because the Turkey deal was so surprising and it was unique in that it kind of defied expectations. Where I talked to a few of the real experts in Russia about this, and there's kind of a range of opinions on whether or not this would happen or not. I personally think that as long as Turkey is in NATO, that Russia would be reticent to export either the Su-57 or the S-500 to Turkey, because then the risk becomes if there's a change of power in Ankara and you now have a more pro-NATO figure in Turkey, and now basically the U.S. can get their hands on not only our premier air defense system, but also our premier stealth fighter, both of which are going to be in service with the Russian military for 20, 30 years. That's a significant technological and strategic risk to take. And so it's a question of whether or not S-400 is already a bit of a risk. If you add to that, it's a bit of a question mark. The other thing to point out with both systems is that neither one of them is ready yet. So the F-35, obviously the Turkish pilots are training on this in the U.S. Now that's been stopped. When were they supposed to be delivered to Turkey? Was it next year?
November 2019. Okay,
so it's not a very good comparison to Su-57, because what's going on right now with them. So Russia signed a contract last year for two Su-57 to be delivered this year, and so they call these the first two serial Su-57s, but they're not really that. And initially, it was thought that in the state armaments program to 2027, because Russia they plan things out every 10 years, although they change it every 5 years. But for every 10-year plan, what was previously known up until like a few weeks ago was that Russia's only going to procure about 15 Su-57s throughout this time. And now Putin made a big splash like a few weeks ago where he mentioned a number of big aviation contracts, one of them being a contract that Russia was going to sign for 76 Su-57 to be procured by 2028. So 3 fighter regiments. But the big question mark is that the Su-57 is supposed to receive a new engine, second stage engine. And the first one, the one they're using right now, is a modified one of what the Su-35 has. And what, basically Russian fighter aviation is still very much tied to Soviet era legacy platforms. And so Su-35 is a significant modernization off the Su-27, as is the Su-30SM, and so on. So this engine is a modernization of that, but it's still not what they want as their main engine for the Su-57. It's particularly something that's going to last for 20, 30 years. And so the second stage engine, right now, they're saying it's going to be ready by 2023, but that might always get pushed to the right because most Russian defense things get pushed back by a year or two or what have you. And so right. The question is, even if Russia's willing to sign a deal with Su-57 to Turkey, Turkey would not receive a Su-57 with a second stage engine until at least like 2024, 2025, the earliest.
Tell the listeners why that matters. Why the current engine is underpowered.
It's just much more capable. I mean, I'm not, I was a former grunt, so I'm not going to explain too good at the fighter stuff. But I know that everyone basically says that the new engine is a significant aspect of the improvement, and okay. that the Su-57 design compared to the F-35, F-22. They've emphasized the Russians have emphasized more the performance aspect than necessarily the stealth aspect compared to our fighters. And so the new engine is a significant aspect to that, as well as, with fighter aircraft, the operational costs are also very much tied to the engines you have and how efficient they are. So yeah, I unfortunately I can't explain that on a better engineering level. But suffice to say, it's a very important aspect of it. And without the second stage engine, the Su-57 is not particularly not something that's particularly desirable without it. And so you could procure Su-57 now without that engine, but if you want this to be in your arsenal for 20, 30, 40 years, you want to plan for the medium to long term, and you're not going to go with that. And so so the two differences here between the S-400 and the Su-57 and S-500. So this S-400, by the time Russia signed this contract with Turkey, it had already been in serial production for 10 years, and Russia had already, on a large scale, procured that system in the Russian military. So their plan was to procure 56 battalions up until 2020. They're set to, I think, reach that this year, even with the export orders. And so Turkey coming in, it wasn't too much of a loss to the Russian military if they still have an S-300P system instead of an S-400, because they already have 20 regiments already in the Russian military.
Yeah, so it gave them the flexibility to meet the Turkish demands for a rapid the rapid fielding, the rapid export of the system to Turkey, because they could offset from their own internal arsenal.
Exactly, and also it with the Su-57. So the company that produced it, Komsomol-Sonamor Aviation Plant, they're supposed to be able to build about 10 to 15 a year is what they're estimating. So if Turkey tries to get on a deal early on, the issue is that it's going to prevent the Russian Air Force from receiving its Su-57s, which they desperately want. Which of course with the S-400 was not that issue, because the Russian military already procured that in mass numbers, and so it becomes another kind of strategic issue where if Turkey were to try and procure these early on, it would be delaying the delivery of many of these to the Russian Air Force itself.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, then you'd have to maybe the before we pivot to the end here, I mean, is like, so I mean, the reason why they're focused on the Su-57 is, like, in theory, right? It's in the same generational class as the F-35, i.e., they're both self-categorized as fifth generation fighters. Right. And so it could be, in theory, right, a one-for-one swap, even though I think categorization of aircraft is a little bit of a slippery slope. But the Turks have also said Su-34 and Su-35. I mean, is that more or less the same thing, or would that be a sort of different dynamic, would you say? So
Su-34 is a tactical bomber.
Right.
And we don't really have one in our arsenal anymore, because we procure multi-purpose fighters that perform that mission, and then we have the A-10, the kind of dedicated CAS platform, which Russians have a version of theirs too. They haven't really upgraded in a while. So Su-34, after Syria, it was heavily used in Syria, and Russia kept saying, "Oh, there's a ton of interest across the world for Su-34s," and ultimately none of that has turned out yet. It's like Algeria was supposed to buy them, they never did. And I think what a lot of countries have seen is said, right, well, instead of getting a dedicated tactical bomber, why not get a multi-purpose fighter that can do both? Can both have an air-to-air component and can also drop laser-guided munitions as well, an air-to-surface method. So I don't know if Turkey wants that, but I think a lot of the countries, that's why the interest hasn't kind of shown up, where they're like, well, if we're going to procure something, we want something to not be so dedicated to this kind of one emphasis, right? And that's what it is. It maybe is kind of broadly comparable to like an F-15E, the surface the ground attack method at the team. And then with the Su-35, Turkey has F-16s. I think they're older generation. The Su-35 is sold as a 4++ generation aircraft. It's good aircraft. There's a lot of interest. So China procured 24 of them. That they got finished deliveries last year. Indonesia is trying to procure 11. There's a report that Egypt was trying to buy 24. A bit of a question mark whether that's going to happen or not. It's a good aircraft. It's a question of, if you already have F-16s, is it worth buying another fighter of the same generation, right? And of course, not only are you getting a new fighter, and if you're going to procure a new system, you want it to be a big difference from the capability of the previous one. And of course, once you start procuring Russian systems, it's a huge procurement logistics effort that goes on behind that, because now you have to train in Russian. So Turks have to start going to Russia to learn to want to speak Russian, to get the spare parts for it, to start buying the missiles for those fighters. It's a huge logistics and procurement decision to make if you start getting fighters that are not made by the U.S. And so it's a question of, is there much value in that? I mean, again, it would be cheaper and easier to continue buying U.S. Fighters instead, even F-16s instead, than going to get the Russian versions. So, again, if this is more of a political, move, and the Russians very much see this as the arms deal is kind of like a tangible manifestation of a change in the relationship, that's good for Russia. For Turkey, I don't think militarily it really is that useful for them, and they could just get Western equipment instead. That would probably be cheaper, even if the unit cost for Su-35 is less than for an American fighter. All the other costs that go on with training and re-equipping and so on would be larger in the long term, and it wouldn't be worth it.
You're making a dollar and cents argument on what is now rapidly devolved into a sort of a man-to-man political top-down agreement for a surface-to-air missile system. But I guess just to wrap up here, I mean, if everything goes to plan, the S-400 will show up in Turkey, or it will be acquired. More recent reporting says it will actually be delivered to Turkey in July, and as I like to call the switch-on date or the deployment date will be in October. I mean, would you fair to categorize this as a pretty big win, both for the Russian, political establishment, but also for the defense industry?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's politically more important than it is from a defense perspective. So, when you look at a lot of Russian arms deals, some of those systems are very much in demand, and the S-400 is certainly one of those. And in general, when they try and find export contracts, they ideally want to find contracts for products that they don't want to procure domestically, or that for a company that might be struggling. And in this case, Almaz-Antey that produced the S-400, they're doing fine. They already have plenty of orders for S-400 going forward. They have, they provide another 10 battalions for India. They're going to start ramping up production of S-500, and they produce a variety of other systems. So they're very much already, fine. The production is fine. And for the producer of Su-57, the Komsomolsk-on-Amur aviation plant, they also are doing quite well. So not only do they have big orders for Su-57 now, they also produce Su-35, which Russia announced they're going to have another contract coming up for them domestically. They have a number of export contracts which are more profitable. They also produce the Sukhoi Superjet, which is struggling on export orders, but domestically, the government has basically told Aeroflot and the other domestic airlines they're basically going to buy this no matter what. So they have plenty of orders there, and supposedly the production of Su-34 is getting moved to the Komsomolsk-on-Amur aviation plant away from the Novosibirsk aviation plant. And so basically, they're doing fine. Their production capacity is going to be maxed out basically the next few years. So for them, they wouldn't turn down an export contract, but from a defense perspective, it's not as useful as if, say, if Turkey decided to procure MiG-35s, Russia would be overjoyed for that reason, because the Russian Air Force doesn't want to buy them, and ultimately they're going to have to buy them if no one else buys them.
Just to keep the design bureaus open.
Exactly, just to keep the employment going, the production line going, and but it's very much the MiG-35 doesn't really fit into the Russian Air Force's procurement plans. So it basically will be a social political kind of decision as opposed to a military one. So for Russia, this is very important on a political level. Obviously, $2.5 billion is not something to frown at. It's important. But at the same time, from the military side, defense side, it's not as valuable as some other arms export contracts would be. It's much more the kind of foreign policy strategic level that they're making a change. And again, a lot of this comes back to after Ukraine, Russia branched out and tried to find relationships with other countries because they wanted to avoid that isolation from the U.S. and the EU. And they've done that. They've done that quite effectively. And part of that was their operation in Syria. And again, now they're a player back in the Middle East again. And Turkey is a element of that. And having a good relationship with Turkey is certainly a important element of that. So all of this for them, it's a lot of people kind of will exaggerate sometimes how great of a strategist Putin is, but on a tactical level, this is a huge coup. I think again, it's still a question over the long term if Turkey ultimately if their next leader is more pro-Western, there might be that concern of our main long-range air defense system is now being looked at by NATO countries, and maybe there's a bit of strategic risk that comes out of there. So I think it's too soon to tell long term what this means, but in the short term, it's definitely a very good thing for Russia.
Well, with that, Rob, this has been a pleasure to talk, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
All right, thanks.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening, and have a good rest of the day.